Where were you on the morning of September 11th, 2001? This day leaves us with questions that still sting like smoke in the air. How did the world's most powerful nation get caught so unprepared? Why did steel crumble, but human courage rise higher than ever? And perhaps the hardest question, what would you have done if you were on one of the 4 planes? Yes, there were 4 planes. Stick with me. We're diving into both the facts and the untold stories. September 11th, 2001 began like any other morning in America. New Yorkers spilled into subways, sipped morning coffee, rushed across crosswalks, and took in the late summer air. That morning, 4 planes lifted into the sky, each with an ordinary destination, but each chosen for a deadly purpose. It began as a regular departure. American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, taxied off the runway at Boston Logan International Airport at 7:59 a.m. Bound for Los Angeles, it carried 92 souls, 76 passengers, 11 crew members, and 5 hijackers, who turned it into a guided missile. The plane was heavy with fuel, prepared for a coast-to-coast journey. That fuel, over 24,000 gallons of jet-grade kerosene, would soon become an inferno in the sky. This wasn't a chance. According to the 9/11 Commission report, the attackers deliberately chose long-haul flights with larger aircraft and full fuel tanks. These were weaponized suicide missions designed to ignite buildings and terror with maximum destruction. Just 15 minutes into the trip, at about 8:14 a.m., Flight 11 stopped responding to ATC commands. Not long after its transponder, used to track the aircraft's identity and altitude, was shut off. The hijackers had taken the cockpit by force. 2 flight attendants were stabbed. The first-class cabin became a battleground. And then came flight attendant Betty Ong. Using an airphone, she was connected to American Airlines reservations for more than 23 minutes. Her voice was level, controlled, haunted.
The cockpit's not answering. Somebody's stabbed in business class. And I think there's mace that we can't breathe. I don't know. I think we're getting hijacked.
Alongside her, Amy Sweeney, another flight attendant, called her airline contact and gave the exact seat numbers of the hijackers, which later helped investigators to determine their identities.
We've been hijacked. They have knives and mace.
Can you look out the window and tell us where you are? Do you recognize anything?
Amy, do you know you're headed toward Kennedy?
I see water, buildings. We're flying low. We're flying very, very low. We are flying way too low.
Their testimonies became crucial evidence. They didn't just report the hijacking, they documented it in real time. They were the first 9/11 witnesses, heroes with no way out. The man now flying Flight 11 was Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian national and trained pilot, calm, clinical, and indoctrinated. Atta made a chilling broadcast from the cockpit at 8:24 a.m., meant for passengers, but accidentally transmitted to air traffic control.
We have some planes, just stay quiet and we'll be okay. We're heading to the airport.
He never intended to return. After seized control, Atta turned the plane southbound, steering directly toward New York City. At 8:21 a.m., he switched off the aircraft's transponder, making it impossible for controllers to see its altitude or identity on their screens. While the FAA and NORAD were alerted, miscommunication and delay meant no military response reached New York in time. The North Tower stood 1,368 feet tall, a modern obelisk of steel and glass. At 8:46, Flight 11, traveling at 466 miles per hour, crashed into the building between the 93rd and 99th floors. The impact obliterated 5 floors instantly and severed all 3 emergency stairwells, leaving no one above the crash with a chance to escape. The explosion was apocalyptic. A fireball roared out of the opposite side of the tower, scattering debris onto the streets of Lower Manhattan. The sound? Witnesses describe it as a thunderclap ripping the sky. First responders thought a bomb had gone off. Between the 93rd and 110th floors, over 1,300 people were trapped. Some called their loved ones. Some made final voicemails. Others waited by broken windows. As flames climbed the tower's core, temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to weaken steel, hot enough to turn stairwells into furnaces. In desperation, some jumped. Beneath the collapse of the 110-story North Tower of the World Trade Center, a group of 14 people survived in what came to be known as Stairwell B. In the chaos of the falling building, a gravitational avalanche of steel and concrete, this narrow well of emergency stairs became a lifeline. At first, news outlets speculated wildly. A private plane. A tragic accident. Even New York's mayor at the time, Rudy Giuliani, thought it was a horrific error. What people didn't know, what no one could yet imagine, was a coordinated attack. And that 3 more planes were in the air. The morning had only begun. Contrary to conspiracy theories, the North Tower didn't collapse immediately because it was engineered to withstand a Boeing 707 strike, the largest plane at the time of its construction. But engineers had not imagined the heat from tens of thousands of gallons of jet fuel, nor the complete severing of critical internal columns. According to NIST's engineering analysis, 36 core columns were either destroyed or severely damaged. Floor trusses sagged. Fireproofing was dislodged by the force of the impact. The building stood, but it was already on its deathbed. NASA satellites recorded the smoke plume from Flight 11's impact stretching over 80 miles. From the International Space Station, astronaut Frank Culbertson, orbiting above, recorded his reaction in his mission log. The smoke seemed to have an odd bloom to it. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The first plane was just the beginning. And then, less than 20 minutes later, horror struck again. This time in full view of the world. It was 9:03 a.m. on September 11, 2001, when United Airlines Flight 175, roaring low and mercilessly fast, plowed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. For millions watching on live television, it was the moment the brain caught up with what the heart already feared. This was not an accident. Flight 175 had taken off at 8:14 a.m. from Boston's Logan Airport, bound for Los Angeles. On board were 51 passengers, 2 pilots, 7 flight attendants, and 5 hijackers, a total of 65 people. Those on board became unwilling participants in one of history's darkest hours. Among them were even young children. Christine Hansen, just 2.5 years old, was the youngest victim of the attacks. Her parents were bringing her to Disneyland. It was nearly identical to Flight 11. Same departure, same model aircraft, a Boeing 767, and the same quiet morning sky. But where Flight 11 was the signal flare, Flight 175 was the hammer. Around 8:42 a.m., the hijacking began. Within minutes, the cockpit had been overrun. Flight attendants were stabbed. Passengers were herded to the back. The plane, now under the control of hijacker pilot Marwan al-Shahi, turned south, veering from its westward course and descending into a new trajectory, one destined to become the second flashpoint of a day unlike any other. Radar data shows the plane's steep turn over New Jersey and rapid descent toward the city. Air traffic controllers watched helplessly. By 9:03 a.m., NORAD still had no interceptors close enough to stop Flight 175. 2 F-15s had launched from Otis Air National Guard Base just moments before, but they were still 70 miles away and hadn't even received authorization to shoot down a commercial jetliner. News crews already filming the burning North Tower captured Flight 175's approach in real time. The plane sliced into the South Tower's southeast face at the 77th and 85th floors. The wingspan spanned dozens of offices. One wing tore through the heart of the tower. The other was vaporized on impact. A fireball the color of gasoline and nightmares exploded outward. Unlike the North Tower, struck nearly 20 stories higher, the South Tower was struck at a lower level, leaving more floors and a greater weight above the impact zone compared to the North Tower. Engineers later confirmed that the intense heat, estimated to be between 1,000 and 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, compromised the steel floor trusses. They sagged, snapped, and caused the floors to fall in a progressive collapse. The South Tower crumbled at 9:59 a.m., just 56 minutes after being hit. The impact zone, floors 77 through 85, was a sky lobby where elevators converged and passengers transferred. That day, Hundreds of people were present in those transfer areas. The fire stairs had already been severed by the impact, trapping those above. It was an architectural Achilles heel. One of the only survivors from above the impact zone, Stanley Premnath, escaped by crawling through rubble and joining forces with Brian Clark, a man descending from a lower floor. Their story became one of the few known survivals from the strike zone. The second strike fractured the nation's psyche. Americans went from stunned disbelief to overwhelming clarity. Someone had planned this. Someone had weaponized our openness, our infrastructure, our very assumptions about safety. But speculation turned to certainty just minutes later in a Florida classroom, where President George W. Bush was reading to school children. At exactly 9:05 a.m., Chief of Staff Andrew Card leaned in and whispered chilling words into the president's ear. A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. The president didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't rise. He blinked once, tightened his jaw, and nodded subtly. He later admitted that in that moment, he knew the nation faced a deliberate act of terror, but he also realized he was in a room full of young children, as he would write in decision points. I was determined to project calm. I made a conscious decision not to bolt out of the classroom. I didn't want to rattle the kids. I didn't want to rattle the country. Beyond the classroom, the entire machinery of the United States was grinding to a halt. Its markets, its borders, even its skies. Within hours, U.S. stock exchanges were shut down and remained closed for nearly a week, the longest closure since 1933. Global markets plunged but stayed open, with financial centers in London, Tokyo, and Frankfurt hit hard by the shock. U.S. airspace was shut down at 9:45 a.m., the first time in history, while border crossings tightened dramatically, especially with Canada and Mexico. Fighter jets were scrambled over major cities. Every skyscraper became a question mark, every passenger a potential threat. America now looked vulnerable. The nation was bracing for the unthinkable, but New York believed it had already prepared for the unimaginable. In 1999, just 2 years before the towers fell, Mayor Rudy Giuliani stood on the 23rd floor of the World Trade Center Building 7 to unveil a $13 million emergency command center, a fortified bunker nicknamed Giuliani's Bunker. It was state-of-the-art, reinforced, blast-resistant construction, independent power and water supplies, and direct lines to nearly every emergency agency in New York City. The location? Just across the street from the Twin Towers. Critics had raised eyebrows even before it opened. Why place the nerve center for citywide disaster management in a known terror target? Their fears proved tragically prophetic. On the morning of 9/11, the command center was quickly abandoned as debris from the falling towers and subsequent fires engulfed the building. By 5:22 p.m., World Trade Center Building No. 7 collapsed, taking the command center with it. The collapse of Building 7 symbolized the loss of command and control in a moment of chaos. On the streets, though, the disaster was felt in a far more visceral way. When the Twin Towers collapsed, they didn't just fall, they disintegrated. The force pulverized concrete, glass, office furniture, paper, computers, and human remains into a storm of fine dust, a tsunami of gray death that swallowed lower Manhattan. Studies later revealed it was filled with toxic materials, asbestos, mercury, fiberglass, and even microscopic shards of glass. It coated everything. People stumbled out of it like ghosts, their faces gray, their hair chalked with soot. In the years that followed, thousands of first responders and survivors developed chronic respiratory illnesses and cancers, leading to the creation of the James R. Droga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act. As the bridges and tunnels were sealed, 500,000 people found themselves stranded in lower Manhattan. Roads were clogged, subways frozen, and panic rising. Then, something extraordinary happened. Not from the sky, but from the sea. From Staten Island ferries to tugboats, dinner yachts to fishing boats, a spontaneous armada of civilian vessels surged toward Manhattan's edge. They came without orders. What followed was the largest sea evacuation in human history, surpassing even Dunkirk. In under 9 hours, over 500,000 people were evacuated by water. Crews worked tirelessly, pulling suit-covered survivors aboard, many of whom had no idea where they were going, only that they were going away from the nightmare. And then came the silence, an empty sky of smoldering skyline and a nation forever changed. Where the Twin Towers once stood, a deep scar remained. The 9/11 memorial was designed as a reverent absence, two vast reflecting pools set in the footprints of the towers, their edges engraved with the names of nearly 3,000 souls. Beneath it lies the 9/11 Memorial Museum, a space carved into bedrock, part shrine, part archive, part witness. Rising above it all is One World Trade Center, also known as the Freedom Tower, a shimmering spire of resilience. At 1,776 feet tall, its height is no accident. It's a number that speaks to the founding of a nation that even in grief refused to bow. On September 11, 2001, the third plane carved a deep wound into the most powerful military headquarters on Earth. And yet for years, its story was often overshadowed by the towers that crumbled in New York. But Flight 77's arc is just as essential, because it didn't just strike a building. American Airlines Flight 77 began quietly. At 8:20 a.m., it lifted off from Washington Dulles International Airport, its nose pointed west toward Los Angeles. On board were 64 people, including 5 hijackers, all trained and waiting. The passengers ranged from everyday citizens to defense analysts and even Barbara Olson, TV commentator and wife of the U.S. Solicitor General. The aircraft itself, a Boeing 757, was a twin-engine commercial jet, nearly 155 feet long with a wingspan that could shadow a 4-lane highway. At 8:56 a.m., as the plane soared over eastern Kentucky, its transponder was shut off. This small device, which communicates location and altitude to ground control, is the plane's digital voice. When it went silent, controllers couldn't see where Flight 77 was or how high it flew. Meanwhile, 2 other planes had already struck the World Trade Center. America's skies were shifting from routine to red alert. But no one yet knew that this missing plane was turning around and aiming straight at Washington, D.C. The name barely registers for most, but Hani Hanjour, small soft-spoken Saudi-born, was the designated pilot for Flight 77. On September 11th, he dove the jet into a steep 330-degree turn, descending at over 2,000 feet per minute, and leveled out just feet above the ground, skimming past trees and cars before diving the jet into the Pentagon at 530 miles per hour. The left wing clipped a generator. The right tore through 3 concentric rings of the building. The fuel exploded like a hammer of flame, and the Boeing 757 disappeared in a hellish fireball. The Pentagon is shaped like a fortress. 5 rings of offices, 5 floors high, a design born out of wartime paranoia and Cold War efficiency. It contains more floor space than the Empire State Building, and it was supposed to be impenetrable. But on that day, it wasn't. Flight 77 hit the newest and most recently renovated section, ironically, one designed to resist terrorist attacks. This section had reinforced steel columns, blast-resistant windows, and a sprinkler system. It likely saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives. Still, the damage was immense. 184 people died, 59 passengers and crew, plus 125 military and civilian personnel inside the Pentagon. Among the victims were decorated officers, janitorial staff, computer technicians, and young analysts. There's something eerie about Flight 77's crash. It wasn't seen on live TV. There were no dramatic collapses, no towering smoke columns filling the skyline like in Manhattan. Most people didn't know the Pentagon had even been hit until President Bush mentioned it during a speech. Only later did surveillance footage emerge. A handful of frames showing a blur, then fire. Even the impact itself was hard to comprehend. There was no fuel fuselage, no tail, just molten aluminum, torn concrete, and shrapnel embedded in walls. Parts of the jet vaporized on contact. A flight data recorder, one of the 2 black boxes, was recovered, but it was badly damaged. Why was the target the Pentagon? Striking it sent a clear message. Even the most fortified institutions could be reached. And it worked, at least temporarily. For hours, America was paralyzed. Fighter jets were scrambled. Evacuations rippled across Washington. Rumors flew that the White House or the Capitol was next. No one knew how many more planes were still airborne. Unlike the first two flights, no military fighter jet was scrambled in time to intercept Flight 77. The FAA didn't notify NORAD until 9:24 a.m. By then, the jet was only minutes from its final dive. This fact, confirmed by the 9/11 Commission report, has sparked years of speculation and mistrust. Why wasn't there more coordination? Was it systemic failure or something more sinister? The official conclusion? A failure of imagination and preparedness, not a conspiracy. Today, outside the western wall of the Pentagon, 184 cantilevered benches float over pools of water, one for each life lost. The benches are arranged by birth year from 1930 to 1998. If the name is engraved at the end facing the Pentagon, it means the person was inside the building. If the name faces away, they were on the plane. The first plane shocked us. The second confirmed our worst fears, but the third plane, Flight 77, punched through the illusion of invincibility. The fourth plane was different. Its fate was written not by hijackers, but by the courage of ordinary passengers. There were 4 hijacked planes on September 11, 2001, but only one never reached its target. United Airlines Flight 93 didn't crash by design or by luck. It crashed because ordinary Americans on board made an unthinkable choice. Flight 93, a Boeing 757, was scheduled to depart from Newark International Airport at 8 a.m. en route to San Francisco. On board were 44 people, 37 passengers, including the 4 hijackers and 7 crew members. But the flight was delayed. Routine airport congestion held the plane on the tarmac until 8:42 a.m. That 42-minute delay, so frustrating to the average traveler, would prove to be a twist of fate that changed the course of history. Because of the delay, by the time Flight 93 was hijacked, the other attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon had already occurred. News had already broken. Cell phones and seatback earphones became lifelines. The passengers had knowledge, and that knowledge changed everything. At 9:28 a.m., as Flight 93 cruised over eastern Ohio, the cockpit erupted in chaos. Cockpit voice recorders captured sounds of a brutal struggle. Co-pilot Leroy Homer Jr. and Captain Jason Dahl fought valiantly as hijackers stormed in. The aircraft abruptly dropped 685 feet in 30 seconds. Controllers heard garbled distress calls, and then a hijacker's voice came over the radio. The hijackers turned the plane southeast, heading toward Washington, D.C. Most experts now believe their target was either the U.S. Capitol, where Congress was in session, or the White House, a symbol of American power. By 9:57 a.m., a plan had formed. The passengers decided to storm the cockpit. They used anything they could: hot water, a food cart, brute strength. The cockpit voice recorder captures their assault. They pushed. The hijackers panicked. They rolled the plane violently to throw the passengers off balance. At 10:02 a.m., one hijacker can be heard saying, "Is that it? Shall we finish it off?" moments before the plane nosedived. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 slammed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at 563 miles per hour, flipping upside down just before impact. The crash left a crater 40 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Nothing recognizable survived. Unlike the other hijacked flights, Flight 93 never struck its intended target. According to Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, had Flight 93 reached the Capitol, the death toll could have been catastrophic, not just in numbers, but in symbolism. A later investigation concluded that the U.S. military was unable to intercept the plane in time. The passengers were the only line of defense, and they succeeded. The crash site was unlike any other. Investigators noted there were no large fuselage pieces, no survivors, and no intact bodies. Flight 93 National Memorial now marks the site. A circular walkway surrounding the crash point, with a 93-foot-tall tower of voices that contained 40 wind chimes, one for each of the heroes. The story inspired books, songs, and the critically acclaimed 2006 film United 93, directed by Paul Greengrass, praised for its accuracy and respect. Congress designated September 11th as Patriot Day, and the heroes of Flight 93 have received the Congressional Gold Medal. They stopped the final attack. Yet even with their sacrifice, America remained on edge. In the air, aboard Air Force One, President Bush faced his own test of leadership in a day that seemed to have no end. By 9:55 a.m., Bush was aboard Air Force One, now transformed into the safest and loneliest place on Earth. He was desperate to return to Washington. His instinct was to be with his people, at the heart of the government, but the Secret Service insisted the White House might be the next target. In an unprecedented move, the U.S. military grounded all civilian air traffic, the first time in history this had happened. For hours, the skies over America were empty, save for a few military jets and the wandering arc of Air Force One. Even Vice President Dick Cheney didn't know where the plane was going. It was that secret. At one point, intelligence came in that Air Force One itself might be a target. The code word Angel, used for the president's plane, had supposedly been leaked. Whether that was an error or deliberate misinformation remains unclear, but it amplified the chaos. By nightfall, Bush insisted on returning to Washington. The Secret Service objected, but he overruled them. "I'm the president, and I'm going home." At 8:30 p.m., behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office, Bush addressed the nation on live television. He looked older than he had that morning.
These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve.
It was the opening salvo in what would become a decade-long global war. Just 3 days later, Bush stood amid the ruins of the World Trade Center, a borrowed bullhorn in his hand, his arm around a firefighter named Bob Beckwith, who had come out of retirement to help with recovery. Surrounded by dust, twisted steel, and grieving workers, Bush began to speak. Someone shouted. He responded,
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The crowd erupted. Bush's leadership in the days following 9/11 saw his approval rating surge to 90%, the highest in U.S. history. The world rallied behind the United States. His push for the USA Patriot Act brought both new powers and new questions. The invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001 was swift, but the mission would grow murky over time. The later invasion of Iraq in 2003, based on disputed intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, would erode the very trust that 9/11 had inspired. Bush's own legacy became inseparable from that morning. Supporters praise his steady hand and moral clarity. Critics point to overreach, secrecy, and war. Yet, as the dust settled, another phenomenon took root. Not in steel and concrete, but in speculation. Conspiracy theories. They grew like weeds in the cracks of public trust. The most prevalent claim? The towers were brought down by a controlled demolition, not hijacked planes. Proponents pointed to the free-fall speed of collapse and the appearance of squibs, puffs of dust ejecting during the building's fall. However, according to multiple peer-reviewed investigations, including the 2005 National Institute of Standards and Technology (NIST) report, the collapse was caused by the intense heat weakening the steel floor trusses, resulting in progressive floor-by-floor failure. Jet fuel, although not hot enough to melt steel beams outright, created conditions that led to catastrophic structural loss. Other myths linger, that Flight 77 never hit the Pentagon, or that the US government allowed the attacks to justify war. Each theory has been thoroughly debunked by independent experts, journalists, and survivor testimony. Yet they persist, fed by distrust, misinformation, and a need for order amid chaos. Psychologists call this proportionality bias, the belief that a tragedy so massive must have an equally massive cause. So steel and concrete can fall, but courage doesn't. That, in the middle of chaos, ordinary people, office workers, firefighters, even ferry captains can rise to extraordinary acts. But this is just one thread in a web of mysteries, forgotten pasts, and unforgettable moments. Curious for more? Don't stop here. Our channel is filled with accounts the world nearly left behind. Which one will you explore next?